Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. I am pleased to say this is our ninth year providing you with what we hope are valuable and meaningful webinars. Our goal in this series is to provide parish staff, volunteers, and diocesan ministers the formation, training, and tools needed to create vibrant Catholic parishes and growing ministries. In today's webinar, Roy Petitfils will help us navigate how to talk to teens about suicide. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. Before we begin our webinar, we'd like to recognize our webinar partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the Catholic Campus Ministry Association. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenter using the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you can see displayed here. I will read as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to you later this week via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Roy Petitfils is a Catholic author, speaker, and psychotherapist in private practice. Petitfils has more than 25 years of experience ministering to youth and young adults in parishes, dioceses, and schools. He has spoken to youth and adults in more than 75 dioceses in the U.S. and Canada, and has given keynote addresses at numerous national and regional conferences, including the USCCB Convocation of Catholic Leaders, NCCYM, Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, and NCYC. Petitfils is also the host of the popular Today's Teenager podcast. Roy, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to go ahead and change you to presenter mode,
Right.
and I'll turn off my webcam and come back on when you are all done.
All right. Show my screen.
Okay.
All right. Well, hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Great to be with you. I look forward to getting your questions. I will keep an eye on that. Whoop, we started in the wrong spot. My bad. There we go. All right. Good to be with you. Thank you for those of you who are watching live, who are with us, and those of you who are going to watch it on the recording. Thank you so much for putting aside some time for what is arguably one of the most important topics that we can involve ourselves in and learn more about with regard to teenagers today. A little about me before we get into how do we talk with teens and young people about suicide. I think Erin said it all. I wasn't realizing that. I was a school teacher and an administrator in a Catholic school, middle school, and a high school. I don't know why that happened. Student activities coordinator. But for the last 12 years, I've been in private practice. And for the last 8 of those, been working exclusively with teenagers. And boy, that's just been a real godsend. I'm really grateful that God has put that on my heart and the passion on my heart, and that he continues to give me life and help not only the teens through the ministry he does through me, but also helps me. All right. So today, what are our goals in this topic, around this topic about talking with teens or talking even to teens about suicide? So the first thing is we want to address, why is the how important? So why does it matter how we talk with young people, with teenagers about suicide? It's always important for us to know the prevalence, because that's something that we are going to want to just know, and that when we know how prevalent it is, will motivate us to want to do some of the things that we are going to suggest that you do, and to keep doing a lot of the things that you're doing. So a lot of folks get value, I find, when I speak, because it just reaffirms things that they knew intuitively, right? There's no new wisdom. So hopefully I can put some language on things that you're already doing, and hopefully, possibly, maybe introduce some new material for you, and some new tips around talking with young people. We're going to talk about risk and protective factors. as well as the warning signs. Now, I know some of you, that's going to be really familiar, but the research shows that when we talk with young people about suicide, that when we read to them or list out for them or speak to them or present them with what are the risk factors. Now, risk factor, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are. What are the protective factors? What are things in your life that make you less likely to complete suicide? And then finally, what are the warning signs that we've got a young person, that we've got a teenager in crisis or heading up to a crisis that could potentially involve them being suicidal? And then obviously we'll spend most of our time on safe and effective messaging with ample time for Q&A, because this is a topic that I think will be loaded with lots of individual questions. So the prevalence, and you're like, Roy, why are we talking about anxiety? Why are we talking about anxiety in a presentation where we're talking about suicide? Because this is going to be important to mention in the messaging, because the vast majority, I believe, of teenage suicides today are coming obviously from depression, but depression that is driven by anxiety. You know, we have an anxiety epidemic, stress, worry. There's a lot of things that's leading up to the anxiety epidemic. But 1 in 4, in some cases 1 in 3 teenagers will experience anxiety. It's more than doubled in the last 10 years, 13 years. It's more than doubled. Now that can turn into depression. Depression affects 1 in 8 teens. Now this is clinical depression. What we mean by that is having a depressed mood is normal, right? But experiencing clinical depression, or as we call it, major depressive disorder, right, means that you have to reach certain criteria for that, and a professional judges it as clinically significant, that this is interfering with your life. So that's 1 in 8. That's 1/8 of schools. That's 1/8 of your youth group who are going to or have experienced a major depressive episode. Now, only 1 in 5 of those teens actually gets help. So what is depression, real quick? Apologize for the font mix-up. It's a serious mental health problem. It's persistent feelings of sadness, worthlessness, hopelessness that last longer than 2 weeks. It's not the same as, but could be a part of bipolar disorder. And with teens, bipolar disorder is something that doesn't usually get diagnosed until the late teen years, because that's when it often shows up. But it could be something earlier. Suicide's the second leading cause of death among young people today between the ages of 12 and 25. The second leading cause of death, and it's and you are asking what's the number 1 cause of death, and that would be accidents. The largest category in the accidents category is motor vehicle accidents. And in 2014, suicide eclipsed motor vehicle accidents in terms of being a reported higher number of deaths by completing suicide than motor vehicle accidents. This population of young people, those young people who identify on the continuums, it's not one continuum, it's multiple continuums of lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer and questioning. And then the T obviously is for gender issues. And those are often completely different things. Not always, sometimes they're overlap, but often completely different things. About 12% of young people identify at some point in time in the teenage years on those continuums. And these young people are at an especially high risk for suicide. That's going to be important because we want to have that in the back of our minds when we're discussing it, when we're talking about it. So understanding the terminology real quick. You might hear the term suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts was what we called it, and then went to ideation. Now we're kind of back to saying suicidal thoughts again. But I want to talk about the differences between active and passive. Now, this isn't for you to be dropping terminology, over cocktails, in the evening. It's more as you continue your education, these are going to be the terms that a lot of folks will use, and in the resources and literature, they will use this a lot. Why is this important? So an active ideation means we've got a kid who would be in arm's length precaution, meaning that we can't let them out of our sight because they have told us, or we have solid information, and that we believe they're an imminent threat to themselves, and we can't, or possibly an imminent threat to themselves, and we can't let them out. They actually have a plan and intends to act on it. They may not intend to act on it, but they have a plan and they're seriously thinking about it. That would fall under active, right? More urgent. These things are more urgent. Now, a passive ideation, this is more important for those of us, even for those of us who are clinicians, for ministers to understand, because this is just as important. It's not as urgent, but a passive suicidal ideation is often indicative of some sort of mental health issue going on. So and that might sound like, I just wish a car would come and hit me. Like, I just wish tomorrow morning I wouldn't wake up. If I could, Mr. P, I wish I could go to Target and exchange this life in for a new one. But I can't, right? Those are all indicating that there's a young person who has serious doubts about whether or not they want to live. And that is coming from either a very, very stressful or unique situation and or a mental health concern. So we want to pay attention to that. Just because a kid doesn't say, I want to kill myself, doesn't mean they're in danger. And what we don't know is how quickly, because all kids do it differently. Some don't, hopefully. If we intervene here, we'll talk about that, right? It might not get to active, but what we don't know is for some kids, they can get there that fast. And some people, it may take forever. So it is important. I wish I weren't here. Things would be better if I just didn't wake up in the morning. I wouldn't mind it if a car were to hit me while crossing the street. So in terms of risk assessment, I just feel we can't, what we know, we can't have this stuff enough. I know it's repetitive. I know a lot of you guys know it, but the research is showing that repetition, continued reminders helps us. So when we have a kid who indicates that they either passive or active, or for those of us who are ministers, more likely you're going to pick up on warning signs. You're going to see stuff online, which we will talk about. You might hear a rumor, right? And so you might bring the young person in, and these are the questions you're going to want to ask. Are you thinking of killing yourself? Do you wish you were dead? Do you have a plan? Do you have the means to execute your plan? Those last two are really just information for you, keeping the young person talking, because if you get an affirmative answer to that number one, as ministers, as non-clinicians, you have to take action. You have to do something. You've got to let the parent know. More in terms of risk assessment, have you ever attempted suicide before? Have you ever thought of it before? So if you're getting negative, have you ever thought of it? Do you know anyone who has completed suicide? Why are those last two important? Because those are risk factors. I'm going to talk about that here in a second. So in terms of warning signs and risk factors, we want to understand that these become very important when they start stacking up and overlapping, when they're shown to be drastic. So we've got a kid who may have some anger issues, but when they start raging and it's out of their personality, most parents, most ministers do not trust their gut. Seldom their gut leads them wrong. If your gut's telling you something's wrong and you don't have, your prefrontal cortex isn't registering the data to support that gut feeling, go with your gut feeling. More often than not, we mess up when we don't trust our gut. Now, again, you've got to know what's your gut and what could possibly be maybe some unhealthy anxiety. But drastic consistency is, are we seeing these behaviors consistently over a period of time? And how intense are the behaviors? We want to know. So risk factor, sorry, this was out of order. What's a risk factor? So a risk factor is something that the young person may have control over. The young person may choose it, but they may not necessarily choose it. They put young people at a greater risk of getting to a point where they could possibly, think of taking their life. So risk factors, prior attempt. These young people are in really high risk. That's a really high risk factor if they've attempted. It's not our job as ministers, right? It's not our job as ministers to be able to decide whether that attempt was an attention-getting attempt or whether that was a real legitimate attempt, whether it was a practice attempt. That's irrelevant to us. if they attempted. Substance abuse is a risk factor. Mental health issues or illness, prior history in the family, we'll talk about that. Access to lethal means is a risk factor. So if we can take guns and ammunition out of the house, especially for a lot of guys who we believe are a threat to themselves, we have made that environment safer and removed a risk factor. Knowing someone who completed suicide. So that's the whole copycat effect that we are concerned about, right? So if a kid in the youth group has committed suicide, or a kid at the church, or someone at the church, it doesn't have to be another kid, right? Or someone at the school has committed and completed suicide, that's a risk factor. Obviously, isolation, lack of access to mental health care is a risk factor. So I heard it said so many times, like, she's been needing to go to counseling, but we just couldn't find anyone. Or we tried a counselor and it didn't fit, and it wasn't good, but that's all we could afford, and therefore it wasn't helpful. So not just mental health care, but good and effective mental health care. And there is a difference. Stress resulting from prejudice, discrimination. So obviously students who identify as LGBTQ, but also racism. You know, there's lots of we live in a hotbed of racism in this area of the country. Historical trauma for various ethnicities, for instance, First Nation, Native Americans, some the Native Alaskans, right? Some of the Inuit folks there. Certainly in many parts of our country, especially in the South where I live, for Black Americans, that sort of historical trauma. That is a real deal, by the way. I know a lot of folks who really kind of minimize that, or just go, oh, that's just you liberals or whatever it is. That's a real deal for people. And that, as ministers, it's our responsibility to take these things seriously. So that's real. So what are those are the risk factors. What are the protective factors? These are going to be very commonsensical, but it's important that we list these or mention some of them when we talk with young people. Now, we don't have to, unless it is a special presentation designated for suicide, which that's fine too. But part of what I'm talking about today is, how do we communicate with young people? How do we bring safe and effective suicide messaging into our ministry plans, right? How do we bring them into our pastoral plan? Like, that needs to be talked about, right? And if you're a youth minister and you're not in charge of whatever, if there is no pastoral plan, then that would be something. How do we care for the young people? You know, we present, we do programs, we do all of these things. Suicide, not only for young people, but for everyone, should be something we're talking about in messaging. So effective mental and behavioral health, right? Obviously, putting them with a good counselor where there's a good fit. And just a pro tip here, the fit, the therapeutic relationship, research has shown over and over and over, is responsible for the vast majority, upwards of 90% of the value that the client gets out of counseling, right? So anyway, that's important. So if you're looking for the counselor, regardless of whether the counselor's got a resume that's 10 miles long and everyone says they're good, if it's not a good fit, then that's a problem. Connectedness to individuals, right? We know that we're getting so much more isolated in our world today. Technology, social media, life skills. We'll talk about that. Problem solving, emotional regulation, coping, self-esteem, and a sense of purpose, or what we might call a calling in one's life. All protective factors. So you see how so many of the things that we do in ministry are these protective factors, right? We've kind of known about this with the assets, developmental assets, and things like that as well. Self-efficacy. This is important because this is tied to a generation of parents who are really deathly terrified to let their kids fail. And so what's happening is that we have kids who are doing things, right? But they because they haven't really failed, they don't have a real deep belief in themselves that they can overcome obstacles, right? So apply that to mental health. You've got a depressed kid who realizes that he's got a tiger by the tail, but if his self-efficacy is low because of his inability to work through failure and work through struggle and persevere, right? If his self-efficacy is low, his hopelessness is going to go up because I don't believe that I have it within me to overcome this. Right now, again, so what's another one? Cultural, religious, personal beliefs. that discourage suicide. So I may not have it within me, but another protective factor would be religious or personal beliefs. Maybe I can't do it, but maybe God can. Does that sound familiar to some of the messaging that we already do? All right, so a warning sign is indicative that we've got a kid who's in crisis, right? Now, any one of these warning signs that we'll talk about aren't necessarily going to, rock the world. However, when they overlap in those 4 criteria that we mentioned earlier, and you guys will have access to the PowerPoint slides here shortly. I'll email those to Aaron as soon as we get done. All right, so the American Society for Suicide Prevention says that we've got warning signs in 6 areas. Roy's going to add a 7th because just in my clinical experience, these are all very important, but there is another one which I'm going to put under the category of online signs and warning signs and what some of those might actually look like. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. You're going to get to read them. Most of these are going to make sense. So before we get into that, so the big 3, the best research that we've got right now on suicide is showing really good research that's been duplicated, is that when these 3 things are happening, this is the unholy trinity of suicide. We have got a kid who there needs to be some type of intervention. When all 3 of these things, sometimes one of them or any combination of them can certainly be enough to push a kid over the edge. And so we want to be paying attention. So a loss of belonging. I broke up with. I got kicked out of school and all my friends are at that school. I've had this many times. I had a sports injury, right? Especially for these athletic kids who have been working their whole life to be able to play high school sports. I had an athletic injury just when I was about to start, and now I'm not going to be able to start. That's a big deal. That can depress the heck out of kids who play sports, injuries, etc. A divorce, a family splitting up, an abandonment of one parent, loss of belonging. A perception that I'm a burden. And so you heard that quote earlier, right? Things would be so much better if I weren't around. Everyone would be so much happier if I weren't around. What we often hear leading up to this is, I wonder if people would miss me if I were gone. Ding, 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 ding. That's a passive suicidal clue again, but it's tapping into that number 2. And then the third one, and we've kind of known this for a while, but we've got research. Impulsivity is the big one here. Not only boys are impulsive, right? Boys get stereotyped that there's this common, I think, societal stereotype that only boys can be impulsive. Absolutely not. I know lots of impulsive girls. So in those 3 things, and I have seen suicides completed based on impulsivity. Like I've seen it, I've heard it. I've heard the stories leading up to it. There was nothing else there other than we had an impulsive kid who was also depressed. And they made an impulsive decision. They were on substances, they weren't thinking clearly, and they were impulsive, right? So those are things we want to know. So warning signs, talking. I'm such a burden. I feel trapped, right? I feel powerless, right? I can't take the pain anymore. Don't have any reason to live. I think I might kill myself. So behaviors, increased use of alcohol or drugs, looking for ways to kill themselves. Sometimes that'll be searching online. Acting recklessly. Again, we're paying attention to these things as they stack up. They're withdrawing, social isolation, more behavior, isolation. We talked about that earlier. If sleep is affected, all of these are warning signs for something. Whether or not this kid might be suicidal, any 1 or 2 of these, right? And one, it's not your job to decide whether how suicidal the kid is. Your job is to figure out if that young person is potentially in danger and to let the family know. But these things are going to pick up, right? These things might tell us our kid might not be suicidal, but we may be able to intervene with a kid who has anxiety or depression, saying goodbye, texting that. I don't hear that one a lot, but it still does happen, giving away prized possessions, aggression. Mood, depression, anxiety, loss of interest in things that they were once interested in, rage, irritability, very common, right? That's part of the definition of teenager. But if more irritability than normal, humiliation, He promised me, like 90% of people who promise not to show other people the nude photos that I sent, and then he sent them out to everyone, or she sent them out to everyone, and now I am humiliated. Can you see how that could lead to a loss of belonging? That humiliation causes things to happen. Not always, but often enough. Depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. For those of us who work with young people, I'm just always filing these things in the back of my mind. So if I've got a kid, when I was a youth minister, if I were in a ministry setting and I know that this exists, these things exist anywhere in the family, that's in the back of my mind. Because that is not just a warning sign, it's also a risk factor that's going to stack up. Health, chronic illness. It is depressing as hell to be constantly in pain, or to not have as much functioning as one had, or if you were born with a, or developed a handicap, any kind of handicap, where you're not able to function fully, and it's chronic, meaning it's lasting a long time, like months even. That can do it. Severe injury, we talked about that. Hormonal thyroid, dysthymia, cyclothymia, low-grade depression or low-grade bipolar disorder, and then substance abuse and conduct disorder, which I would say we know that it's usually a sign when kids get into legal trouble. Environmental signs, stressful life events, we know that. Prolonged stress factors such as bullying and relationships, access to lethal means, more environmental exposure, we talked about that already. Exposure to graphic sensationalized accounts of suicide, which is why we were all up in arms on the first 2 seasons of 13 Reasons Why. I think there was a lot of fatigue around 13 Reasons Why. I didn't see a lot coming out on season 3, even though I heard it's just as bad physical violence. Historical, previous attempt, family history, right? Mental illness and violent behavior. Now, perhaps most importantly for us are going to be some of these online signs, because this is where 90% of their communication is happening between one another and the public. And so we want to be paying attention to this. Posts alluding to a loss of hope. I just don't know how I can go on anymore. Young people today, and it's I'm going to call it the Snapchat effect. They are very passive aggressive in this way, in that they post stuff like that and they get real upset when their friends don't respond to it. And it's an attempt, it is a cry for help, and one that we want to pay attention to. We should be talking about this with young people, because they're often going to be the first ones to pick up on these online warning signs. I present it to them just like this. Posts that indicate a teen has experienced one or more of the big 3. Loss of belonging, burden, right, impulsivity, posts depicting suicide, self-harm, etc. And we want to watch out for just passive stuff. We want to be listening to rumors that, oh, I saw this post online, etc., etc. These are really, really, really important. So, talking with young people and teens about suicide. What are some of the do's? What are some of the things that we should do regarding safe messaging? So, one, please talk about it. Talking about suicide is extremely important. It is a myth that talking about suicide causes young people to consider suicide. That is a myth. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Not talking about it creates an environment where young people who are thinking about suicide, or who may stumble onto thinking about suicide, where that can fester. So we do want to talk about it. We want to emphasize, when we're talking about it, help seeking. So we want to encourage it. Even if we feel the teens aren't listening, they are hearing it. So we want to emphasize help seeking, and we want to provide info. And there's 3 PowerPoint slides full of resources, downloadable resources, for you, and as well as resources that you can point teens to. So not only encourage it, give them the info to make it easier. Emphasize preventive factors. So let young people know, and there were some that I didn't mention that I want to mention, and some of them are common sense. Sunlight, exercise. I make it a point 3 or 4 days a week to make sure that I get out in the sun and get 20, 30 minutes of sun when possible. And when the weather changes, I might get a sun lamp, or I may make sure I have a vacation to the Caribbean or someplace the sun is shining. That's a big deal. That is a huge big deal. So that exercise, taking vitamins, good nutrition, healthy sleep. These are all preventative factors, even though we didn't mention them earlier. Teach the warning signs to young people, if not only themselves, that they can be aware of what's happening and other folks. Risk and preventive protective factors as well. Absolutely. Teach them that so that they can use it. What do we not want to do? Right. And this information has been around a while. We don't want to present the suicide or suicide in general or a particular suicide as this unexplainable act as a result of stress only. It really can feel invalidating to people who are experiencing it. And when they're experiencing it, it often feels like a mystery to them very often. And it's like the whole house is on fire. And so we don't want to present it as a complete mystery, but we also don't want to present it as an oversimplification of this is what causes it. There are a lot of factors that usually lead someone to commit complete suicide. We don't want to normalize it or present it as a common event. And so if you do list the statistics in terms of 1 in 8 teens experience depression, suicide is a second leading cause of death. We also want to present that in a tone and in a way that it's the reality of the tragedy of that comes through to teens. We don't want to go, you know what, it's suicide's pretty common. It's not something, don't get worked up about it if you have suicidal thoughts. That is not what we want to say. We want to communicate, if you have suicidal thoughts, we want you to talk to someone, preferably an adult, or an adult in addition to a friend who you might more likely want to go talk about. Don't focus on the personal details of people who have completed suicide. We want to be careful around that in terms of specifically what they were going through. Now, that will be different from a testimonial, which we will talk about here in a second. But when we're talking about someone else, we don't want to focus on specific details. We'll also talk about being careful. Is that coming up? There it is. The overly detailed descriptions of victims or of suicide methods. Research shows that when we do that, that causes young people to commit suicide. So talking with them, talking about protective factors, don't do it, blah, blah, blah. I hear some young people saying they're getting suicide messaging fatigue a little bit. Yet I do believe that it's still worth it, because I think it's a message that hasn't been delivered nearly enough, and one that we can do. But you don't want to go, you certainly don't want to show pictures or anything along those lines. Again, that's what 13 Reasons Why I did, and one of the reasons we were so concerned. So hope and resiliency. These are important as we're constructing the message and talking with them about it. Understand that this generation of young people have a much lower resilience to traditional stressors than our generation had, than my generation had. And probably we were lower than generations before us to traditional stressors. So when your resiliency is low, think of it like an emotional, mental health immune system. When your immune system's low, it doesn't take that big of a bug to come along and give you the flu or a real bad bacterial infection, right? Okay, hence trauma. So I can experience events that affect me way more negatively than they should if I had a higher emotional immune system. More trauma, more mental health issues, therefore we can have more suicide. And so resiliency is huge. That's important. These things connect very tightly, very tightly. And so we want to talk about resiliency, right? And so our testimonies, and I want to own it. And for those of you who have heard me speak, probably anytime 5 years ago or before, I was a pro at bloodletting. I really, sharing my story and sharing my testimony has been I've been learning about it and how to do it and how to do it better. But when young people get up and basically just describe, or we have adults get up and they basically just describe just how bad their life was and trauma, that helps young people connect, because they go, yes, I too struggle with that. Now, bloodletting is an overly detailed description of some of the really terrible events that have happened in someone's life with no real focus. What's the testimony? I've sat with folks, mostly adults, I wouldn't say this to teens, and go, you don't have a testimony, right? You're getting up there and you're talking, and sure, it's bad and they can connect with you in that, but you've got to take them somewhere. As a minister, it's our job to take them somewhere. So that testimony, whether or any other messaging we have on retreats and programs, etc., each one, and again, I know this is more work and we all do as much as we can do, obviously, right? But needs to focus on hope, perseverance, and resiliency. So if you've got a kid who's got a testimony, or if you've got a volunteer or whatever who's got a testimony, when they're getting up there, so where they're going to connect with, what did you overcome? How did you overcome it? What were specifically the things, the people, the experiences, the tools, the skills you used? Now, very often we may have to help people find that in their testimony, which is very often why it's hard to write one by yourself if it's your own, right? You need other folks helping with that. These are important because I still hear young people coming from retreats and this being some of the most powerful stuff. The good news is that it doesn't have to make it longer. We can shorten the bloodletting part of it, or the obstacle part. And how did you persevere? What thoughts did you think? What feeling? Who encouraged you? Why do you think you chose to persevere? We want to push them because we don't want to deliver it as a mystery, right? Some things happened and I was blessed. And even if that person feels as though I was just blessed with good genetics and I lucked out, right? We still want to push them and have them at least say, and while I may have been very blessed, and in terms of I didn't necessarily do anything, I do know that there are things that you can do. That would be important. And even if they could tell a story of someone, a brief story of someone, anonymously even, who has persevered and overcome and showed resiliency. It's really, really, really important. This might be the most important slide for ministers. So encouraging teens to speak up. This is tough. This is part of our messaging. And so when we're talking, you're giving a talk to a large group, or you're talking to even a small group of teens, we want to encourage them, and we want to talk to them about confidentiality, right? This generation of young people has an unfathomable amount of loyalty to one another. And so going to an adult and letting someone know, right, that my friend is thinking about taking their life, or I'm really concerned about my friend, we want to let them know that that does not fall within the bounds of confidentiality. I'm going to say it, but I didn't put it on the slide. We want to tell young people, don't let your friends tie your hands. And the more of us that communicate that, I communicate it, and I know kids are thinking, what are you talking about, man? I'm not going to out my friend, but I'll tell them, don't let them tie your hands, because they're going to start with going, I need to tell you something, but can you promise you won't tell anyone? No, I can't promise. I can't promise. I mean, if I'm worried about you, I care about you. They feel like they're going to be betraying their friend. And so we want to address that. So you might be feeling like, man, if I let this person know, I might be being betrayed. But I can tell you, there have been folks who knew about something and didn't let someone know, right? And that the feelings that they had the next day were much worse than betrayal. We got to be careful with that, because we never want to let young people believe that they are ever totally responsible for the life of another, right? But we do become who we are through other people. It is a community. And while I don't want to do that, I also want to make sure and let young people know, like, we need you to speak up. Contrast the fears, right? So I know you're afraid of losing your friend, and I think we got to name it. And so when we encourage it and say, look, if you're concerned about your friend, please come and talk to us, right? And I know you're probably afraid that you might lose your friend. And you know what? We got to say it just like this. You know what? You might. I cannot guarantee that you didn't. You won't. You might. But what I'll tell you is, very often that friend comes back because they realized how much you cared about them deeply, that you cared about them enough to have them not like you. Right. And sometimes if it doesn't, you can at least go to sleep knowing that if you're going to feel much better than you would have if something would have happened. Obviously let them know the consequences of that. And most often we can keep it to ourselves. We don't have to out the kid who came and told us. So encouraging healthy boundaries. We want to let young people know you are responsible too, but you're not responsible for other people. You're not responsible for your friend's life. Because what happens is, we got a kid who's suicidal and their friend who's not talking to anyone feels responsible for that other kid's life. They may be going down in the pool drowning with them. And now we've got to go save 2 drowning people. So you're responsible too. I'm responsible to them, but I'm not responsible for them. In fact, a 17-year-old, there are very few people in the world, if any, who are responsible for a 17-year-old. Their parents, responsible to them. I can't control you. I can't be responsible for you if you can beat me up and walk out of the house and steal the car. Right? So I can't do anything there, right? So we're responsible to, not responsible for. We want to recognize that young people, when they do set boundaries, we want to definitely recognize them and affirm them is a better word there. Reassure them that they did the right thing when they do come through, and we also want to empower them. So how do we broach the subject? Like, how do we bring it up? Be clear, bring it up. Actually, before that, I would say ask permission. Hey, would it be okay if we talked about a real sensitive topic? Asking permission. Make observations. And I always do it like this. Hey, would it be okay if I made an observation? It lowers the resistance in the teen. Just say, it looks like, you've really been struggling lately. And I just want to know. And because I know how prevalent, how many teens think about suicide. I just, want to know, have you had any thoughts of it? How you doing? I would ease my way into that. But if in doubt, I'm not saying to not be clear. I'm not saying to not be vague, but what I mean by that is I might try and give that young person an opportunity, and depending upon who you are and how much experience you've got and and there's a lot of nebulous factors here, right? A lot of times you can get that young person to tell you, and you don't have to out them. However, I will out them and ask them and go, I'm concerned about you, and I will be very clear if I can't get them to open up. I express concern. I care about you. You're not in trouble. I care about you. Ask for feedback. Tell me what this was like for you. Me coming to you with this, and then listen to what they say. The goal here isn't the biggest goal here when we have to go to a teen and bring it up is to make sure that this young person and that young person's parent, that they connect, and then that parent connects to a mental health service, right? And so if we tick off the teen unnecessarily and or the parent unnecessarily, the likelihood that that happens goes down. So what hurts? Anger, yelling, obviously, shaming people who have these thoughts. Obviously, I know most of us won't. Minimizing is the biggest danger because suicide is so horrific and mysterious and ununderstandable to many folks, we will tend to float down that long river in Egypt denial, right? When no one wants to believe, especially that a young person, right? How taboo and countercultural is that for almost all that a young person wants to take their life? We certainly don't want to punish. We don't want to be condescending, right? If you don't believe that young person, you better hide it, right? That's not helpful. That's not helpful because it might push an impulsive young person and go, all right, you don't freaking believe me? I'll show you. We don't want to be patronizing. Oh, well, you're just kind of, you're a kid or whatever. You're still a teenager. That's not helpful. Ignoring it, not talking about it, that denial, certainly romanticizing it and glorifying it. So I've got a whole handout that could be its own webinar in terms of if you've had a suicide happen. I'm also going to email to Aaron that PowerPoint as well, that you can have it about how some tips and some tools and some things to do if you've had a suicide and you're responding to a suicide in your community. But we want to be careful that we don't romanticize it. And part of the way we romanticize it unknowingly and unintentionally sometimes is by overly memorializing the individual, naming a race after the individual, having a t-shirt made. It really sounds like those of us in the mental health community are really, really, really being, a bad word. Like, what's about that? Like, man, that's just uncompassionate. This is where the research supports us here on this, though. Like, we know those things trigger suicide. And I can tell you as a young person, when I was 535 pounds and didn't want to live, most of high school years, I had a passive suicidal ideation with months of active ideation. I can tell you that and I felt invisible. And so if there was a big to-do made about someone who had completed suicide, I guarantee you that that thought would have gone into my mind and gone, maybe I could get a t-shirt made. They'll see me. Now they'll see me. And obviously denial. We talked about that. To catch up with me, if you want to reach out to me, I'd love to hear from you. All the social media on Snapchat as well, even though that's not up there. And I think, Aaron, I got a couple more slides after this, but I think we're going to make an offer to you on the book at a discounted price for those of you who are here on the webinar, which is awesome. So excited, so grateful to Ave. You guys don't know this, and I know that you're on a lot of webinars, but it's important to understand that books aren't written by individuals, that they're written by teams of incredibly competent, dedicated, and hardworking people. And I'm confident that this is my best book by far, and it's because there was a great team working on it. RoyToday'sTeenager.com, and then the Today's Teenager podcast. So questions?
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much, Roy. I'm going to go ahead and take back presenter mode
Okay.
from you. Okay. And people can begin to type in questions. What you have presented obviously gives us a lot to think about. I know that I personally have been affected by suicide, so have my children, and I'm sure there are so many people, on the webinar today who have been affected also. And as you said, some of this isn't necessarily new, but it's great to be reminded, and especially when we when we confront a situation that we get nervous, having some of these tools in our toolbox to navigate is really, really helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
I do have a question here from Adam. He says, Roy, on this bringing it up slide, how do we best approach the parents if we notice some of these signs? How
Yeah,
do we bring it up with the parents, even knowing that sometimes the family life can be a factor or risk?
for sure. So that's its own. I took those slides out intentionally because there wasn't enough for me to cover the stuff that we know is most important for me to cover. Here's what I will say though. I've got lots of videos. I'll send those to Aaron too if we want to just kind of link them up in the thing in terms of that's very important because that is the handoff, right? In terms of talking to a parent. So empathy is the first thing we want to be thinking. What's going to be going through that parent's mind, right? And if you're a parent, Adam, like you know it. The worst possible thing in the world is that you're telling me that one of the most important people in my life, my kid who I'm responsible for, I feel that way, wants to take their life. So automatically denial kicks in. They just don't want to hear it. So I always start with these words when I have to tell that to a parent. I can't even begin to imagine what it's like for you to be able to come here and have me tell you, assuming that they kind of already know what you're bringing them there for, which they probably do because you had to make a phone call and get them there. I can't imagine what it's like for you. Tell me what it's like for you. And then I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen to that parent because now I've got another emotional issue here. And I'm going to listen. My job isn't to do therapy. My job is to do a few things there. One, communicate the information to the parent because I have zero chance of helping that kid without getting the parent on board. Secondly, help maintain the parent's emotional regulation because if they lose it, now we potentially lose the kid. I don't want to shame the parent, and that is easy to do around. The parent is already shaming themselves. What the hell have I done wrong that's caused my kid to want to take their life, right? And share that with them. And then next, to be able to offer them specific names and resources, put it in their hand, text it to them, email it to them while they're in your office or wherever, so that they have the resources, that they have a high sense of self. Oh, I can do this now. I know right where to go. I don't have to figure out who I can trust. The person I do trust, the youth minister who might have just saved my kid's life right now, has told me who I can trust. But do your homework on that first. So I hope that helps. And I've got tons of other stuff on talking with parents about it.
Okay, great. Christy says, thank you for this. How do we
Oh, you're
talk to
welcome.
students with same-sex attraction?
Yeah.
Um,
Great
in a
question.
manner that doesn't trigger suicidal thoughts? And kind of piggybacked on that, how do we use our Catholic faith in discouraging suicide when we bring the issue up to our
All
kids?
right, hold on to that second one for me, Aaron, because I
Okay.
won't remember it.
Okay.
But the first one is, so if I'm hearing the question right, you tell me how you hear it, Aaron. That we're going to do a presentation on the Catholic Church's sexual moral teaching on
Correct.
lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. Okay, great.
Correct.
Well, that's a great question. That's a whole nother slide deck. um, and so, how do we present on that topic? That's really tough. It's really tough. And that being said, I think you could at least mention that. Like I've had a lot of young people come in to me who are on those continuums, who are having suicidal thoughts, and they would tell me that the DRE in their parish or the youth minister never really checked in on them. So before we get into how do we give a talk, are we aware of who the young people are in our group to the best of our ability who might be struggling with that? And then individually going to them, which is what I would do because their risk of suicide is 3 to 4 times higher than any other kid in that group just by virtue of that one warning sign, right? When we talk about, you know, how would you talk about gluttony to a room full of people who are overweight, assuming that that's why they were overweight? And I would say with the LGBTQ stuff, we're still assuming a lot. There's still a lot of research. There was a landslide study that just came out that indicates strong indications that there are genetic markers for homosexuality. I would be shocked if that didn't also get replicated around the gender stuff. So so often, we communicate this pray it away message, which is not helpful. We want to be compassionate. We don't want to get into this sin is worse than that sin game. And if we do a talk on that and it's not around suicide, or we do the suicide talk and don't communicate that they're in a special risk, we just got to be careful. Kids know. Are you talking about that? And why aren't you talking about other sins? So
Absolutely. How do we use our Catholic faith in discouraging suicide when we bring up the issue to our kids?
yeah, I just think to say that, well, one, we're going to want to start with hope, right? Where some people might be inclined to go with that is to go, you're going to go to hell if you commit suicide. And I'll be perfectly honest with you. When I have clients who tell me that that's the reason they don't take their life, okay,
Okay. Hmm.
I'll take it.
Hmm.
If you feel like you saw Barney and Barney told you not to kill you, awesome. Let's roll with it. Great. Awesome. Now, that's not something that I want to tell them though. If that's something that they've come to me with already, let that sit. You've got enough. My job's to keep you alive. So hope, right? We want to encourage hope. We always want to point back to the greatest thing in our faith, which is the Paschal mystery, right? Which we have in the Eucharist, right? Christ suffered, Christ died, and he rose again. The resurrection piece of that is so important. Um, uh, Talking about that at Easter time, I think, is so important as well. That there is hope. That there is
Yeah,
hope. I mean, that's the Christian message.
right. And there's nothing that we can do to take away God's love for us and
Amen.
for that
That's
suffering.
exactly right. Thank you, Aaron. That's
Yeah,
exactly right.
yeah. Jacinta asks, so if you go to a parent, to express maybe some concerns that you have about their child, and they don't seem receptive to it, or they don't seem to care, I put that in quotation marks, what to do? What would you do from there?
It's a good question. Depends on how bad off the kid. Let me tell you how I would do it, and then let me tell you how I would encourage you to do it. Um, how I would do it. If the kid is really bad off, I'm going to do exactly what I told you to do. And if I still don't get the parent to where they get it, um, I am going to let the parents know that if I don't get a call from the hospital in an hour, that I will be calling the police. So that's how I would do it, and because I think it's that big a deal, and I just have no patience anymore for parents who won't do it.
Mhm.
Um, I get it, but I'm going to reverence that parent, and I'm going to use empathy, and I'm going to go at it the right way, and I'm going to respect them. But I'm going to walk with them, right? So here's what I would do if I were you. My good buddy Ella Malevska in New York City always says, "Go one up." So, you're not going to call the police, probably, right? If I were you, I would strongly recommend, whether if you're in a school, you go to your principal or guidance counselor, or then you go to your pastor and say, here's the situation. Because what you've now then got is someone else. So if one doesn't work, we go in with two. So
Mhm.
now the pastor goes in with you, or your supervisor goes in with you, and now we let the parent know, we're not going to walk them through the whole empathy thing. We're going to be nice, but we're going to let them know that this is serious. I'm
Mhm.
also gonna hold up that consequence contrast for the parent to be able to say, you might be right, but what if you're wrong?
Mhm.
What if you're wrong? And what if something happens before you get urgent on this? What's that going to be like for you? Now
Mhm.
that's a last resort. I don't like that type of fear emotional manipulation, but I'll use it as a last resort to save a kid's life.
Mhm. Absolutely. Somebody here is interested in, she missed your thoughts regarding the 13 Reason Why series. Do you
Yeah.
have anything else you want to say? I know being a teacher, kids were like, this is so good. I love this show. And you're thinking,
hmm
ah,
Well,
that's
so
so
let me
good,
be
right?
honest. Despite many requests from many people for me to do something on this last one, I did it on the first two. It was so triggering for me and exhausting, and it cost me so much money in therapy after each season because I let slip that I just decided I couldn't do the third one. I just for my own health, and I hope you see that as a boundary. Now, I'll tell you what's in the first two. As a minister, and you're not going to get triggered, watch it. It wasn't just the watching it, it was the constantly talking about the issue that really kind of didn't do me in, but brought me to a struggling place. I think ministers could watch it. I still strongly discourage young people from watching it. Now, which young people you might discourage? Certainly kids who are at risk. It could be really triggering. But just want to be careful. And I've read the synopses of season 3. It's just as bad.
Mhm. And
However, as a minister or as a parent, a lot of stuff that they portray is very real. And if you want to understand what life is really like in high school, now it's exaggerated, but there are some things in there that are real. I just decided not to do a video on that, even though I thought that was really important. Um, anyway,
okay, you didn't do any blogging on it then, or
not this
you just
last
watched it,
season,
but the
but the
first
other
two?
two, yeah,
Okay.
I would check out the other two. And for
Okay.
those of you who don't want to watch it, Google synopses. They have had them for all 3 seasons. You can get what you need to get without watching it too.
Okay. Wonderful. All right, Roy. Well, we thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you guys. Thank you all
For
for joining.
Absolutely. For all of our listeners, I will put all of Roy's information in the email and the various PowerPoints or whatever resources you're going to send us. I was
Awesome.
interested too when you talked about like having a pastoral plan as a parish
Mm,
for, if someone does end their life, and perhaps some of the resources you have.
yeah. So here's who I'd recommend. This would be Sean Robinson.
Okay.
I think he's in the diocese. I think it's Toledo, I think. No, or
Okay.
Cleveland. I don't know. In Ohio,
Okay.
who is, I mean, he's the guy on that.
Okay.
He's
Okay.
done considerable work and has a mountain of resources for that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, we did want to extend an offer to all of you on Roy's book. I know last year you talked a little bit about your book on a webinar, and I said at that time that I find this book to be incredibly worthwhile and worth every
Mm,
penny. And so I repeat that today. So 20% off webinar 0924 for today's date, and that expires on the 4th of October. Thank you again, Roy. I want everybody to know that this webinar is recorded along with all of our webinars and can be found at our website, as well as the fact that I will send that link to you tomorrow. And next Tuesday, Katie Prejean McGrady will discuss the future of youth ministry in light of Pope Francis's exhortation from the Synod on Young People, how this is going to impact youth ministry in the future. So we really encourage you to sign up for that webinar also.
wow.
Well, thank you all so very much. This has been great, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Roy.
You're
Bye-bye.
welcome. Thank you guys.
Bye-bye.